Now, 2011 will unquestionably be remembered as the year of protest and revolution. It began at the very end of last year in Tunisia, and then the Arab Spring spread like wildfire. As the year draws to a close, Occupy London still holds tenaciously to its campsite outside St Paul's, and protesters are still dying at the hands of the Syrian authorities.
There are sounds of gunfire ringing out across Tripoli tonight. I can see plumes of smoke in the night skyline.
And after prayers, tens of thousands more descended on the square. They call this a day of departure for President Mubarak.
How does it make you feel as an Egyptian?
Very, very, very proud. I've never been more proud of being an Egyptian in my life.
We've got leaflets here if anybody's interested. There'll be in the information tent. They have to be called to account. They have to be saved.
Throughout the year, be it in Syria, as we heard there, a woman described planes and tanks were used and children and young people were being killed. In Tahrir Square, in Libya or in London, women have often been at the forefront of protest, and they've suffered sexual violence as a result. One Libyan woman talked of being raped. A judge in Cairo has ruled this week that virginity tests used on female protesters were illegal. So what has made so many women put themselves at risk, and what impact will their protests have on their lives? Laurie Penny took part in the London Slut Walk and Occupy London. Nabila Ramdani is a journalist who specialises in the Arab world. Nabila, how surprised were you at women's involvement from the beginning in the Arab Spring?
Well, I think the uprisings across the Arab world was certainly a time when the revolutionary Arab women grabbed the attention of Western media. I think it was surprising in more conservative countries and traditional societies like Yemen and Libya. But in countries like Egypt, for example, women first took to the streets in 1919 to protest against British occupation. In Tunisia, for example, it wasn't surprising to see that many women were in fact behind the Jasmine Revolution, because an open education system produced an extremely capable class of professional women. And they have indeed been, as you said, at the front lines of protest. They have taken to the streets en masse. They have shouted slogans. They have braved tear gas, or even worse, torture, killing. And the media were particularly fascinated by the educated, articulate bloggers and activists who have been feted as the leaders of the revolutions. And in some countries, they have even smuggled munitions and cared for the wounded.
Laurie, how far have the concerns of the Occupy movement had feminism in their roots?
Well, the interesting thing about the Occupy movement, both in America and as it spread across the world, has been how they've been working out their aims and goals very much as they've gone along, and they are socialist aims, really. They are. It started out about bringing the banks to account, financial justice, and then really has become a wider discourse about social justice, and that is very much feminist at its root. I'm one of those people who believes that you can't have socialism, or indeed social democracy, without feminism. However, there have not yet been explicitly feminist calls at the heart of this social movement. And what's going to be interesting over the next year, as we've also seen feminist activism flowering across particularly Britain and America, is to see whether the dialogue of sexual liberation and the dialogue of economic justice are going to meld together, because they have been separate things this year.
To what extent, Nabila, have women had to face punishment and physical humiliation in the Arab countries where the revolution has taken place?
Well, we've seen how in Egypt, for example, they have been appallingly treated by the Egyptian military, which rounded up women on regular occasions and submitted them to a virginity test in order to not only humiliate them but also intimidate them so that they don't, go back on the streets and make and put forward their grievances. So that's quite, of course, appalling. Worse, in other cases, women have been arrested, killed, tortured, and that includes children, unfortunately.
Tawakkol Karman was arrested in Yemen, but subsequently awarded the Nobel Prize, was one of the women to get the Nobel Prize. To what extent have women emerged through protest as potential leaders?
I think it's important to remember for a start that women's rights didn't begin with the Arab Spring. I think it has gone on without the attention of Western media and the world's media in particular. What the Arab Spring proved is that it might be more difficult, in fact, to overturn male-dominated societies where you have deep-seated patriarchal customs that constrain women rather than getting rid of dictators. Now the dictators are gone, the work really begins.
There have been, Laurie, accusations of sexual abuse, even rape, in the United States. How safe and fair to women have you felt the protests you've taken part in?
Well, there have been allegations of sexual assault in Britain as well, at Occupy Glasgow, and also at Occupy Edinburgh. Nothing has been proved so far. But I think it's one thing that has dismayed me has been, particularly from men involved in the Occupy movements, how quick some people, not all people, have been to say this can't be taking place. And, you know, women should be quiet about it because this is damaging the movement. And I think one of the things that has emerged is that the Occupy movements, when they started, was seen very much as, you know, as making an ideal society in these little refugee camps from capitalism, almost. And people have realised that, particularly people who have privilege, whether that's racial privilege, class privilege, male privilege, how much we carry those privileges and the assumptions of those privileges into any new space we create. After the revolution, we're still going to have to deal with the question of who has physical power and who does the dishes. It's so people really need to interrogate themselves, and it has been encouraging to see, on the other hand, some people, you know, quickly coming forward to say this is not acceptable. We have to analyse ourselves as well and talk about how we're treating women. There have been some solutions, like, for example, in New York they had a safer spaces tent where women could go to feel safe. Now, it was sad that they needed that. That was a solution they came up with. But then, you know, you saw the NYPD coming in to tear up the safer spaces tent, literally punching the tent, tearing it apart. So,
but when it comes to activism, when a protest is actually happening, in your experience, who does the speaking and who does the dishes?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, isn't it? That's always the problem, and it has still been the problem over the last year of activism, and that men, particularly white men, particularly well-educated, middle-class white men, have been not only putting themselves forward to speak, but they've been the people who the media have come to make statements about where the movement is going. They've been the people writing the press releases, and what's kind of sweet, I think, is how far there is a dialogue within the movements about how we stop this happening. I saw, and people, you know, bless them, they try so hard. I think on one protest, a female friend of mine was standing on the protest line, and you know, a man had been speaking on the megaphone loudly, and then suddenly I think realised that he'd been doing too much speaking, and then sort of grabbed my friend and said, "Hey, you know, say something. You know, we need a woman to talk. It doesn't matter what you say, we just need a woman to say it." So, you know, bless, you know, they are trying. They're making a lot of mistakes, but I hope that they will get somewhere in the end.
Nabila, I mean, it almost seems trivial to compare what's been happening in Syria with what can happen in London. Syria is in the headlines now. We know that the violence is continuing. To what extent are we hearing the voice of women there, as we have in the other Arab countries?
Well, unfortunately, Syria has now descended into a proper civil war where the situation will only be resolved by implosion, in my opinion. Women are more in the background now. We're not seeing, many women taking to the streets now to voice their dissent or to call for political change, because it's a far more dangerous environment than it was at the beginning of the uprising.
What about lasting effects in the countries where the revolution almost seems to have had some successes. Libya, for example, Egypt. What will happen to the women's lives as a result of the protests that they've taken?
I am quite optimistic about women's place in the Arab world, but I think we have to be slightly cautious. Let's not forget that women have been let down by revolutions in the past. In Iran, for example, when they supported the revolution against the Shah, it resulted in a curb in their rights in 1979. And I think we have the situation in Tunisia gives us great hope. Women won around 25% of the seats in the new assembly, which is a better share than in the US Congress, for example. In Egypt, for example, there are concerns that the previous gains made by Egyptian women will be reversed. They are currently being excluded from the political process, and they're not being put in winning positions on electoral lists for, in the current parliamentary elections, for example. In Libya, we've seen how the more traditional forces have taken over by implementing Sharia law and restoring polygamy.
And Laurie, how important are women-specific protests, like the slut walks that you took part in, or the Moth March that happened?
Well, if I can just come back to something we were talking about before, the question really is how far we see women as victims in these global movements and how far we see them as leaders, because a lot of the discourse, particularly this year, has been around what are these awful regimes doing to women, what are the police doing to women, women in these protests as victims rather than as necessarily agitators, as activists and leaders, and that's not necessarily the case. You know, women have been on the forefront of these protests from the start, and rejecting that role of simple social victimhood is part of what the slut walks are about. The slut walks, I think, were very, very interesting, and I was honoured to be invited to speak at the London Slut Walks. I think the energy was fantastic because it was all about not just saying we don't want a culture of rape, we stand against rape culture, but it was about positive sexual liberation as part of the conditions for gender liberation and social liberation as a whole, saying, you know, owning the idea of being a slut, the idea of being as sexually active as we want to be, the idea that, you know, we are our own people. We can own ourselves, and that, I think, what I will be very, very interested to see is if that can be integrated into the wider movement and the wider sense of social change.
There has been controversy this morning in the papers. The BBC's in trouble again because one of the faces of the year 2011, the female ones, is a panda called Sweetie
the panda.
Now, let's keep our sense of humour about Sweetie. But who would you have chosen, Laurie, to put on that list?
Well, one person I would definitely choose is the journalist Mona El-Tahawi, a pioneering Egyptian journalist who has been terrifically brave in her coverage of the Arab Spring, and who has recently had an interview published in The Guardian where she talked about the fact that her arms were broken and she was sexually assaulted in covering recent uprisings in Egypt. Her writing has been incredibly important and her coverage has been unparalleled, so I would pick Mona El-Tahawi.
And Nabila, who would you put on there?
Well, in many ways, for me, 2011 has been the year of the Arab woman. So I was disappointed not to see the Yemeni woman, Tawakkol Karman, who became the first woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, to be on the list. She delivered a message to her sisters, her Arab sisters, saying that the big challenge ahead is to win their rights in a society dominated by the supremacy of men. And I think I agree with that.
Nabila Ramdani, Laurie Penny, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.